There's a mistranslated word buried inside a text almost 2,000 years old. One word, and it changes everything spiritual power was ever supposed to mean. Maybe you already have enough. Maybe you're carrying too much, things that should have been returned a long time ago. What if what's missing isn't something you learn? What if it's something you simply never had? The soul crosses 7 spheres. On its way back to its origin, at each one, it hands something back. Not destroyed, returned. Thoth recorded it. The same scribe who witnessed the judgment of the dead 1,000 years before this text was ever written. You are not chasing 7 powers, you are standing in front of 7 pending returns. Which one is still trapped inside a sphere you've never crossed? This is the audit no one told you to take.
There's a mistranslated word buried inside a text almost 2,000 years old about the soul. That one word changes the entire meaning of what people call spiritual power. There's an ancient text that describes the soul climbing through 7 stages, handing something specific back at each one before moving on. Almost no one reads that passage the way it was actually written. If you think spiritual growth means acquiring what you're missing, wait until you understand the opposite. Maybe you already have enough. Maybe you're carrying too much, things that should have been returned a long time ago. I found this out the hard way on a specific afternoon in 2019, before I knew that feeling even had a name. I'll come back to that in detail. How many of these 7 powers have already come back to you without you noticing? And which one is still trapped inside a sphere you've never actually crossed? There's a specific feeling of sensing that something is missing without being able to name what it is. It isn't sadness, it isn't generic anxiety. It's quieter than that, the suspicion that you should already be more whole than you are. You compare your clarity to other people's, and the comparison never quite adds up. They seem more settled. You don't know exactly why. It isn't a lack of spiritual effort. You've read, you've practiced, you've tried, you've consumed plenty of content about this, and the feeling of incompleteness stays exactly where it was. Maybe it's in a work meeting, watching someone decide with a firmness you don't feel. Maybe it's in some ordinary conversation, noticing the other person seems to carry less weight than you do over the same kind of problem. Maybe it's just the mirror in the morning before you leave the house, that second where you notice a tiredness that shouldn't be there. The detail doesn't matter. The pattern does. The real fear, the one almost no one names, is different. What if what's missing isn't something you learn? What if it's something you simply never had? That specific fear is more common than it seems, and it's rarely said out loud because admitting it sounds like defeat. I carried that fear too, for years. It became concrete in a specific way on a Thursday in 2019. I made a decision I now recognize by an exact name. In the moment, it had no name at all, just the feeling of being pushed by something I couldn't quite explain, not even to myself. This video is about that. 7 things you already are by nature, according to a text almost 2,000 years old, and about which of them may not have fully come back to you yet. Most people who talk about lost spiritual powers read the central text on this subject the wrong way. The Corpus Hermeticum, in the treatise called Poimandres, describes the soul crossing 7 planetary spheres on its way back to its origin. At each sphere, it hands back a quality tied to matter. The dominant reading treats these qualities as vices to eliminate. Arrogance, greed, deceit, things to destroy, purify, overcome. That's what most commentators repeat without checking the original text closely. You might think this is just translation, some unimportant detail of vocabulary. But change one verb in a law, in a contract, and the entire meaning shifts direction. It's no different here. In the first treatise of the Corpus Hermeticum, in Brian Copenhaver's reference translation, published by Cambridge University Press in 1992, the text doesn't use the word eliminate. In that same passage, verse 25, the word used is hand back, return. It isn't about destroying something bad inside you. It's about giving back something you borrowed and haven't returned yet. When you swap eliminate a vice for return something borrowed, the question changes completely. You stop asking what you need to destroy in yourself. You start asking what you're still carrying that should have been given back a long time ago. It's a small correction in vocabulary, but it redirects the entire work from elimination to return. It also changes the tone for whoever hears the text. Eliminate a vice assumes something is broken in you, something to be corrected by force. Return something borrowed assumes something else, that it was never truly yours, and giving it back isn't failure, it's just ending a loan that was already overdue. Think of a tool borrowed from a neighbor, kept in your garage for years. You're not at fault for using it when you needed it, but keeping it forever, thinking it's yours by right now, is a different problem, very different from the problem of having used it once. Most people who feel like they're carrying too much, the exhaustion after a conversation, the dream that came true, the sudden knowing they can't explain, assume something is wrong with them. But ancient Gnostic tradition described this exact condition centuries before psychology had a name for it. It's called the unmediated spark. Sophia herself, the final emanation of the pleroma, once acted without her pair, without mediation, and what followed wasn't punishment, it was distortion. If your gift floods instead of flowing, drains instead of guiding, it isn't because you have too much of it. It's because it's still unmediated, the spark without its pair. Stay until the end of this video and check the link in the description. What comes next is waiting there for you. The fragment of proof is this. In verses 24 through 26, Poimandres explains, to the one Hellenistic tradition calls Hermes, but who carries the function and the name of Thoth, that the soul, rising back to its origin, crosses 7 spheres. At each one, it hands back something specific. It isn't a vague list, it's precise. The moon, the soul returns the capacity to grow and shrink, the pattern of swinging between extremes, unable to hold any middle ground. Second sphere, Mercury, it returns the scheming of evil, the calculation, the maneuvering, the strategy used to tilt an outcome in your favor. Third sphere, Venus, it returns desire's deception, wanting something for a reason that, if you were honest with yourself, isn't the real reason. Fourth sphere, the Sun, it returns the arrogance of dominance, the need to be above, to control the space around you just to feel safe in it. Fifth sphere, Mars, it returns reckless boldness, rash daring, acting from an urgency that doesn't come from any real assessment of the situation. Sixth sphere, Jupiter, it returns greedy appetite for wealth, accumulating beyond what's needed, out of fear that enough will never be enough. Seventh sphere, Saturn, it returns the deceit that sets traps, lying in a structured, planned way, not out of impulse. 7 qualities, 7 spheres. None of this was invented for this video. It's recorded in verse 25 in Copenhaver's reference edition, 1992. None of this is about the spiritual world in the abstract. Each one describes a behavior you've already seen up close, at work, in a relationship, in a decision you made alone, without consulting anyone. Hold on to these 7 names. We'll use them again in a more practical way later in this video, and one of them is going to come back far more personally than you expect right now. Notice what this already changes. If these are 7 specific returns, not a generic purification, spiritual work stops being vague. It becomes a checkable list, 7 items, not some hazy concept of evolving spiritually. This still isn't the full case. It's the fragment that proves this structure exists with this precision for more than 1800 years. And that kind of precision doesn't usually show up alone in history. It shows up again somewhere else, much earlier than you'd expect. Pause here. What I've shown you so far is real, but it's only half the story. The half I gave you comes from the 2nd or 3rd century after Christ, when Poimandres was written in an already Hellenized Egypt. The missing half is much older, more than 1,000 years older. In the Book of Coming Forth by Day, what we now call the Egyptian Book of the Dead, the soul of the deceased is judged in the duat, the realm of the dead. Their heart is weighed against the feather of Maat, the goddess of truth and balance. The pyramid texts, even older, dated to around 2400 BCE, already record fragments of this same journey. And the one who records the verdict, witnessing every stage of the judgment, is Thoth, the same figure, the same scribe who, 1,000 years later, appears in Poimandres, guiding the soul through the 7 spheres. The Egyptians were already describing a soul-crossing stages, judgment, purification, guarded gates, witnessed by Thoth long before Poimandres ever existed. Poimandres didn't invent this structure of stages, it inherited it, and it's exactly that older half that changes the weight of the more recent one. When a Greek author in 2nd or 3rd century Egypt sits down to write about the soul rising through 7 spheres, he isn't creating from nothing. He's inheriting an entire culture that already thought about existence this way, in stages, witnessed, written down. There's a pattern here I can't treat as coincidence. I'll show you 3 instances in fields that shouldn't agree with each other at all. First instance, the Egyptian funerary system, more than 3,000 years ago, already described the soul being judged in stages, each one requiring something specific to be left behind before moving to the next. It isn't one stage, it's several, documented in detail, with specific guardians at each gate, figures painted on tomb walls, each one demanding a different password before letting the soul pass. Second instance, in 2008, researchers at Harvard, Buckner, Andrews Hanna, and Schachter, published in the Annals of the New York Academy of Sciences, mapped what they call the brain's default mode network. It's the network active on mental autopilot, the one that sustains the same repeated thought patterns day after day. Contemplative practices reduce activity in that network, and that's linked to less automatic thinking and more mental clarity. Third instance, in 1980, physicist David Bohm of Princeton published Wholeness and the Implicate Order. He proposes that reality has layers, an implicate order, deeper and unmanifest, that unfolds into the reality we perceive. Each layer subtler and less fragmented than the one before it. Bohm wasn't writing about religion or the soul. He was trying to solve a problem in quantum physics and arrived at a structure of layers anyway. You might think I'm stacking convenient coincidences to prop up an argument. I had the same suspicion until I checked the dates and the original sources one by one. A funerary system 3,000 years old, a neuroscience study published in 2008, a theoretical physics proposal from 1980. 3 fields that never cite each other, don't know each other, with no disciplinary relationship between them, describing the same basic structure, layers that must be crossed, one at a time, to reach something more fundamental underneath them. I'm not saying Bohm's physics proves the Egyptian myth or the Hermetic texts. That would be forcing the evidence too far. I'm saying something else, more precise. The recurrence of this structure in fields that never spoke to each other demands an explanation that none of these fields alone can offer. When I swap eliminate for return, I find 3 layers opening up, one inside the other. First layer, the 7 powers aren't vices to destroy, they're borrowed qualities, which the soul picked up to function inside matter, that already changes the whole tone from punitive purification to simple return. But that first layer opens a question it doesn't answer itself. Borrowed for what, exactly? If they were borrowed, there was a specific moment when borrowing made sense. Second layer, each quality was borrowed to survive a specific condition at a specific moment. The sun's arrogance isn't gratuitous cruelty. It's the tool you used when you needed to dominate a space so you wouldn't be dominated in it. Mars's reckless boldness isn't impulsiveness for no reason. It's the urgency you used when waiting felt too dangerous in that moment. That's already more interesting than the first layer, but it opens even further. Third layer, if each quality was a survival tool, the question was never which powers you need to conquer. The real question is, which of these tools are you still carrying even after the condition that demanded them has already passed? You might still be dominating spaces that no longer need to be dominated, still acting with urgency where no real danger exists anymore, still accumulating out of a fear that no longer matches your actual situation years after the original situation has passed. The tool worked at the time. That's why you kept it. The problem was never the tool itself. It was continuing to use it in a phase where it only gets in the way. It's true for Saturn too. The deceit that sets traps wasn't born of malice. It was born of a moment when trusting openly cost too much. You learned to structure things, to plan alternate routes, to never rely on plain truth alone. It made sense back then in that specific time. The question is whether it still does. I'll stop here, not because the spiral ends, but because this third layer is where the whole argument needs to turn. The question isn't what you need to conquer, it's what you still haven't returned. Everything I've built up to this point points to a single thing, and what it reveals is different from what it seems. Spiritual power, the way most people treat the term, isn't a category of acquisition. It never was. It's a category of audit. This isn't a prettier way of saying the same thing. It's a real redefinition with a direct practical consequence. If power is acquisition, the right question is, what more do I need to learn? If power is audit, the right question is different. What am I still carrying that I should have already given back? And that changes what's possible from here on. Whoever treats power as acquisition keeps stacking technique on technique, book on book, never quite feeling like they've arrived anywhere. Whoever treats power as audit examines what they already have and discovers that most of what feels missing doesn't need to be conquered. It needs to be let go. You're not chasing 7 powers, trying to reach them. You're standing in front of 7 pending returns, waiting to be made. It's like organizing a house that's too full. The problem is rarely a lack of space. It's an excess of things kept out of habit, with no real use. The box of stuff, I'll use it someday, pushed to the back of the closet for years. The solution isn't building a new room. It's opening the closets and deciding what still earns its place. And from here, this video is about locating exactly which of these are still yours. If the question now is which of these 7 you've already returned, the checklist needs to be practical, not abstract. The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, founded in 1888 and systematized by Israel Regardie in 1984, structured its initiation grades exactly around these 7 planets, not by aesthetic coincidence. Because the structure already existed before them, and they built a practical system of progression on top of it. Let's go through the first 3. The moon. Do you still swing between extremes, no middle ground, and call it just how I am? Excited one week, gone the next, without understanding why the intensity never holds? Mercury. Do you still calculate angles and strategies in conversations that never needed any calculation at all? Rehearsing a sentence before saying something simple, afraid of losing some invisible edge? Venus. Do you still want things for reasons that, if you were honest right now, you know aren't the real reasons? Wanting approval disguised as desire for something else? If you recognized any of the 3, it isn't a personal failure. It's a sphere that hasn't been fully crossed yet, and now, at least, it has a name. 3 done, 4 remain. And these weigh more because they involve less small vanity and more survival structure. The next 4 aren't subtle. The sun, do you still need to be above, controlling the space around you just to feel safe in it? Hard to accept a suggestion, hard to share command. Mars, do you still act from urgency that looked at calmly from the outside had no real need for urgency at all? Deciding too fast just to avoid seeming indecisive? Jupiter, do you still accumulate more than you need, driven by the fear that enough will never be enough? Work, money, commitments, always one more than you can handle? Saturn, do you still build elaborate structures and plans to guarantee an outcome that plain truth would have guaranteed on its own, preferring to control the scene over trusting it would resolve itself? Statistically, at least one of these 7 hasn't fully come back to you yet. That isn't a sign of spiritual delay. It's a sign that you're human and still carrying what you borrowed to survive a phase that may have already passed. What's left is which one in your specific case, and there's a good chance you already have a suspicion. Even before I go on, I'll show you exactly how I found mine. I didn't find mine through guided meditation or some sudden insight at a spiritual retreat. I found it reading a text almost 2,000 years old on an ordinary afternoon, not expecting it. The missing piece, until now, is this: I lived the 5th sphere before I knew its name. On a Thursday afternoon in 2019, in a specific meeting, I defended a decision that, looked at from the outside, was clearly risky. I defended it because backing down would have looked like weakness, not because the decision was good. The feeling in the moment wasn't clarity. It was being taken over by an urgency that came from no real assessment of the situation, as if the rush wasn't mine. Months later, reading that section closely for the first time, I reached the 5th sphere, Mars, reckless boldness and rash daring. I stopped in the middle of reading. It wasn't an abstract concept. It was the exact description of that specific Thursday, the same tone of voice I used, the same rush to close the subject before any objection. The pattern I described in the Mars sphere, in the checklist I just walked you through, I lived it fully without knowing it had a name 2,000 years after someone had already written that name down. I reread the passage 3 times to make sure I wasn't projecting something that wasn't there. It wasn't. The description was too specific to be a coincidence of reading. What I'm about to say isn't argument anymore. It's what I found. That Thursday, I wasn't making a bad choice from lack of information. I was on loan to a sphere I hadn't returned yet. The urgency I felt wasn't mine. It was Mars's survival tool, activated in a situation that didn't need it. I spent the following months reliving that afternoon over and over, trying to understand why it weighed so much in memory, even after the decision worked out fine in the end. A good outcome didn't erase the feeling of having been used by something I hadn't consciously chosen. Today, when I feel that same kind of rush show up in any decision, I recognize it. I don't eliminate the rush on the spot, but I already know how to name what's happening, and that changes how I respond to it. No one told me that day that it had a name. Thoth had already written that name 2,000 years earlier in a text I wouldn't read until months later. The 7 powers aren't a list of future conquests. They're an audit of the present. You're not building these powers. You're discovering how many have already come back to you without you noticing, and how many are still trapped in a sphere you haven't consciously crossed yet. The question in this video's title wasn't rhetorical, it was literal, and now you have the 7 names to answer it. If this shifted something in you, not curiosity about Hermeticism, but the recognition that you're still carrying a survival tool that's already done its job, this channel exists to keep this audit going, one sphere at a time. I didn't tell you which of the 7 is yours. I can't know that for you, but if you made it this far, you probably already know which one weighed the most while I was talking. It isn't for everyone, but if it was for you, the channel is here every week with the next piece of this same investigation. So here's what we discovered together: the exhaustion, the isolation, the feeling that no one understands what you carry. None of it means you're broken. It means your spark has been operating without mediation, exactly like Sophia's before her fall. I spent months mapping out exactly what it takes to pair that spark, grounded in real Gnostic and Hermetic tradition, the Apocryphon of John, the Corpus Hermeticum, Jung's psychology of the anima. The result is the trilogy of the unmediated spark, 3 books. The first shows exactly why your gift feels like a curse. The second gives you the syzygy protocol, 7 steps to finally pair it with what's always been missing. The third takes you to who you become when the pairing holds, Sophia Restored. The link is in this video's description. If this is resonating, it isn't chance, it's the spark recognizing its own reflection. What this video left unexamined is what waits after the 7th sphere. Poimandres calls that point the Ogdoad, the 8th sphere, where the soul, already stripped of the 7 qualities, moves on toward wisdom. The next piece will examine exactly that, what Sophia is as a real destination, not a decorative metaphor, and what changes when you understand where the 7 returns are actually taking you, sphere by sphere, all the way to the end. Consider the invitation on record for whenever the next step of this investigation is ready.